So we're going to be making a connection to the Wiki-Map API and just using the example key. So there's a number of examples within the documentation that you can select where they've got the endpoints, and also they have some example endpoints and paths here that you can connect to make the queries and return back data. So data can be returned back as JSON. There's quite a lot of information coming back from the JSON connection. And then what we're doing in this lesson is updating the input fields, providing ability to search within those coordinates, and then returning back the 5 results from those coordinates with a title and a link to more information. So if the coordinates change, the results are also going to change. So in this case, we're not able to find anything. Let's change it to 3. So we're able to find 1 item at these coordinates. So that's longitude and latitude. So as the user updates those, it's going to update the results that are coming back from the API. And we did apply a little bit of styling with CSS. Lesson, we're going to be connecting to an API at Wiki-Map API, and that's going to be the website what we're going to be connecting to. So I've set up the index file with doc HTML, opening the HTML tags. We've got some space here for styling, so if we would want to apply some styling to the content that we're outputting, and then we just have the standard HTML tags here. So we've got an H1 to indicate a title, and then we've got also an input area. So if we need to input some content, we can use that element, a button, a div to output the content, and then linking to the JS file, so the JavaScript file. And that's where all the magic is going to happen. Within the JavaScript file, I've kept some of the setup variables that we did in the last lesson, where we selected the elements from the page, we updated some of the values of those elements on the page, and then also added an event listener with the button click. So this is going to be a similar format where whenever the button gets clicked, then we're going to be connecting to the API. So there's a lot of useful APIs out there. When you do a Google search, you'll also notice that there are quite a bit of various APIs that you can connect to. So one of them that we're going to be demonstrating today is going to be the Wiki-Map API. So if you, and for this one as well, I just did want to note that in order to get a key, you do have to sign up with them. So this is an optional thing. If you're not interested in signing up, then you can just skip this lesson. And I did want to note that within this video, we are going to be using just the example key, and that appears to be working at the time of filming this video. So it may or may not be working when you are looking at it. So this again is an optional lesson, and this is just going to be a demonstration of the various APIs out there that you should or that you can check out, and that you do need to sign up for it, and how you can make use of various websites with the endpoints. So going over to the Wiki-Map API, they've got information about how to connect to the API. So I did set up a key already, so I've generated a key. So I'm ready to start using the API. They've got the required parameters here. So there's always going to be an endpoint that we're connecting to. And in this case, it does require a key within the base URL. And that's the one that we're generating. And then we just add in the key value here, and then the object that we want to get information about. So all of this, and they've got an example here of how to connect. So we'll do the first, we'll just do the example and select this endpoint. So let's go back into the coding area and copy the URL. And I'm going to add that in as a variable name for URL. And then we'll manipulate it afterwards. So right now it does have an example key in there. I'm going to toggle the word wrap. So let's just go back into the JavaScript and refresh. And when we click the button, nothing's happening. And this is where we can make our load, so that our fetch request to the URL. And then we've got the promises. And returning back the JSON object. And taking the JSON and returning it back as JSON. And actually, I won't call this JSON. I'm going to just call it the response object. So the response that comes back, and then sending it back as JSON. And then when we get the data back, we're going to take the data and output it into the console. And we'll try this out. And we don't necessarily know if the endpoint is receiving back JSON. And remember, we are using the example key. So let's see what happens. And we can also add in the catch as well. So if there are any issues, then we can catch the error. And let's output the error message into the console as well. So run the code. And we get this interesting message that we haven't seen before, where we get unexpected token and then lesson side in JSON at position 0. So generally what this error means is that this isn't properly structured JSON data. So we're trying to force it into JSON as we were expecting JSON, but in this case it's not going to be structured JSON data. So let's see what happened. And now when I just return it back as text, this is what we get back. We get an XML return value. So then this is XML object with a bunch of text on the page. So how about we take this content and we output it into the output area. So we take output inner HTML and we'll equal this to whatever the contents of data is. So let's see what gets returned back here. So it looks like we got quite a bit of information being returned back here. And again, this isn't structured JSON data. So we need to check in to see if we can force the format. So there is an option to force the format to be JSON format. And that's the one that we're after. And all of these APIs are going to be different. So keep in mind that they're going to have different documentation, and usually the first place to start is to go to the documentation just to see what type of documentation and how you can do the response value. So in this case, they do have an option here for format equals, and then let's set that format as JSON. So we'll add and then format it as JSON. And we'll see what then gets returned back. So this is a JSON formatted structure that just got returned back. And now, because it is JSON, this is going to be a whole lot easier for us to read and to deal with. So let's also output it into the console. And then what we'll do, instead of outputting the data, we're going to parse it and stringify it and output the data that way. Because now that it's going to be a JSON data, it's going to be a JavaScript object, and then we can parse through it. So using JSON stringify, let's stringify the data that we're outputting into output. So try that another time. And at this point, you can use the console to output the JavaScript content as an object. And it's returning back the content of ID 55. So what if we want to search and we don't want to get it by ID, but we want to search the content? So let's go back into the API. So you can get the place by area. You can get the place by ID. You can get the nearest place, so to latitude and longitude. And there's also a place search. So in this format, we can do a function place search. So let's update the string and function, and we're going to do a place search. So make sure that we're writing it out properly. And in this case, we're not going to need an ID, but we are going to need a query for what we're searching for. So let's search for the word tower. And these are the required parameters in this documentation. So we can search for the place search with the required parameters. And let's load that and see what we get back. So invalid coordinates. So let's try another endpoint, and we'll try the one here where we've got the example of places get nearest. So this is going to return back the nearest places to this latitude and longitude, and then we'll create an input where we can update the latitude and longitude. So it's going to return back places to the nearest latitude, longitude. Make sure you keep the format JSON so that we're returning the data back within a JSON format. And now let's try it out. And that was a copy and paste issue there. So let's again refresh that and try it out. So it is returning back the 5 places that are nearest. And then this is the places array that we could loop through and output the content. So let's make a few updates to the page. Where beside the input, so the first input can be the latitude, and you can change these with the various parameters. So there's the latitude and longitude, and those are the parameters that are changing. And it looks like we're still working off of the example keys, so you could continue as you practice to work off the example key if it is working, and if not, then you might have to sign up for a key in order to be able to access the API. So creating another input, and we'll do this with JavaScript, so val2, and using the document, and that's going to be to create element, so creating a separate input, and this input val2 is going to be, let's set an attribute, and the type is going to be text, and then the input val2 value, and we're just going to set these as the default latitudes and longitudes. So the first one will have this as the default, and this one will have this as the default latitude. So this one is going to be the longitude, and this one is going to be the latitude. So now we're going to have 2 input fields, and let's add that to the page. So adding it in, and we'll use the document body, so just append it to the body. And add the input val2. And instead of append, let's do a prepend. And what also we can do is select the H1, and we'll hide the H1. Or we can prepend it, so that will shift it up above the inputs there. So that will just move it around on the page. So that way we've got the longitude, and then we've got the latitude, and we've got the option to load search map. So search map longitude, latitude. So now we're able to update these parameters to get the nearest, and we need to have these dynamically updated. So let's, within the fetch request, we'll create a temporary URL, and that URL is going to append to the existing one with these parameters. And a lot of times in the query string, it doesn't matter what order, so we're going to just shift the order around here. So we're going to have the URL, and then concatenate to the URL the latitude and the longitude. And now these numbers, I'll use the template literals, so the backticks, and use the URL root and concatenate and. So we want to pick up the latitude and longitude numbers. So for longitude, we're going to get the input value of whatever it currently is. And for latitude, we're going to get the input value of the first input field. So whatever that current value is. And that way we can use those to create our web URL. And then just update the string variable. And also, good idea to log it out into the console so that you can see the URL, what it looks like. So that's the URL that we're running, and it looks like and the reason is that we're still using the URL, so it's not getting a proper structure because we're not updating and we're not trying to connect to the temporary URL. That's why I always put it out into the console, because that way if I want to check and make sure that I've got a working web URL, I can simply click the URL out into the console and see if that's going to be opening up. So copy the link and paste it into the console and just see what's getting returned back. So it does look like it's proper JSON and it's properly taking and returning the content back. Let's see if we update this, if that changes. And I'm not sure about coordinates. And it looks like at these coordinates we're not actually finding anything. So a little bit of trial and error here, and if we go back to where that original location was, you can see that it's changed. So now we can output some of this content and iterate through it and output it on the page now that we're getting the data coming in. So let's do that as well. And I'll just call it maker. And then from here is where we can iterate through and we can loop through the data object. So mainly just the places that we're going to be iterating through and then outputting that within the HTML. And looping through, so take data and go for each one of the items within the data. We're selecting the elements and let's log it out into the console. And just run this function here. So we see what we're returning back. And we're not able to loop through because we're trying to loop through the full data object. And we want to loop through the data places. So we have an option here where if we want, we can just send over the data places. So make sure that it's always the array that you're trying to loop through. And again, use the console as needed. So it looks like we've got a number of items here that we can output. So we can do a title, URL. There's also the polygon as well. And let's see what type of content we can use. So this is going back to the search that wasn't working. So in this case, it does require the query as well as the latitude and longitude for the search parameters. And if you go to examples on the Wiki-Map API, you can select and let's search by the coordinates, get nearest, and those are the default coordinates. So send a request. And we want to format it with JSON. And for this, you do need to have a key that you've added. So this is just for demonstration purposes where you can connect to the API examples. And a lot of them will have these example endpoints that you can check out and see the results that you're returning back. Your API key to try it out within their trial. So let's go back to the documentation. And then using the data that we see within the console, let's output some of this content. So we do have a title. So create some elements. And using the document, create element, create a div, and this is going to be the title. So the text content of title is going to be equal to the element, and again referring to the object for the property name. So I can use dot notation in this case. And then output, append, title. So there's all the titles being output. We can also have a hyperlink. So instead of doing a title, I'll just create a main div container just to save a little bit of time. So this is just optional how you want to approach this and how you want to output the content. So in this case, if I do the inner HTML, we can add all of the structure within the inner HTML. And that's going to save us some JavaScript for creating the elements. And wrap it in a div. So let's comment out the inner HTML that we're outputting here. And I'll just comment out the JSON results. So that way we're only seeing the actual results that we want to look at. We can link to URL HTML. So it saves us some time on outputting some of the content, because we can just simply put it within the URL HTML. So it's going to add the URL HTML for us. So it already structured the HTML for us, saved us a little bit of time there. And from here you can update and add content as needed. And that one, you get rid of the paragraph. And I'll just separate it as an HR. So we've got separation. And we can click the links to find out more information about that particular object. And let's add some styling. So border. And round it slightly. And with some padding. And center it. Let's set a width of 80% for it. And let's add a hover option to it. And set the opacity. And for div, using class list, add, and add the class of box to the elements. So it provides a little bit more structure to the elements on the page. And we don't need the HR, the horizontal rule. And also let's do a margin at the bottom. So do top and bottom of 10 pixels for a margin. So that gives us the ability to connect, output some useful information from another web API with a different data structure. The task for this lesson is to find a web endpoint. So you can use the same one that I used, the Wiki-Map.org, and connect to the API and retrieve the data as JSON data. So a lot of them might have XML, and look for ones that have a format in JSON, review the data, and create a JavaScript object from the data. So if it is JSON formatted, then you can, within the fetch request, you can structure it as a JSON object or JavaScript object, and then use the data on your web page. And then lastly, create a way for the user to update the results dynamically from your web page, making queries to the API so that you're getting dynamic results being returned back to the user.